ahead and get started. The senator this morning is on a little bit of a schedule. So I'm going to introduce Senator Mike Braun, if he would like to make his way up to the chair in front here. Senator Mike Braun spent his career building a small business into a national company in his hometown of Jasper, Indiana, before finally getting fed up with the business as usual in DC and running for Senate to bring future common sense and straight talk from the private sector to the waste and gridlock of Congress. Thank you, Mike, for being here this morning. Moderating, official moderator, is Indiana Farm Bureau President Randy Kron. He would prefer his bio to be, he is a farmer, but I can't let it go with that. He's also a recognized Indiana prairie farmer and Purdue College of Ag Master Farmer, and was highlighted on the Purdue Farm Management Tours earlier this year. So with that, I'll hand the mic over to Randy and let him begin to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Hans. Is it all right if we just sit down and make this a casual conversation? Sorry, we've been cutting beans and the bean dust just eats me up, or it causes problems. But we are fortunate to have Senator Braun here, and when I see Senator Braun and I talk to him, he's kind of like one of us. I know he has, one of two that have some farming experience or farms in the Senate. Maybe, I don't even know, is that all of Congress? I know it's in the Senate.
In the Senate, John Tester from Montana would be somebody that's still actively involved in farming. And other than myself, that's about it. The rest of the folks on the Ag Committee generally have to listen to their 20 to 30-year-old staff members to kind of tell them what's going on. And I think it'd be a refreshing difference if we can get more people to kind of do stuff before they go to DC. I think you can weigh in better.
Well, it's kind of nice if they're passing bills or things that are going to impact agriculture, that they at least understand what the ramifications of the bills that they're going to pass is. So we appreciate you being here, Senator Braun. Like I said, I consider him one of us, and from Jasper, built an excellent business, and he understands business. So, but we're here today to talk about a bill that you were carrying and actually passed the Senate. And in the climate in our nation's capital right now, there's not too much bipartisanship, or pretty partisan. Probably that's an understatement. But anyway, you worked on Growing Climate Solutions Act. I just call it the Climate Bill. But anyway, it passed 92-8. So I mean, unbelievable that you could actually bring both sides of the aisle together. But when I think of all the climate, carbon things that are going on, it's kind of like the Wild Wild West. And I think I'm going to just ask you to give a highlight overview of this bill, because I think you're trying to bring, I don't know, sanity or some, for it's understandable and make sure who the players are. Could you just give a high level review of what you're doing here?
So your description of Wild Wild West, you could also throw the Hatfields and the Coys in there when it comes to, sadly, how things work on major issues out in DC. One side of the aisle wants more federal government on everything that we do. If we'd be knocking it out of the park when it comes to the federal government, that's one thing. In the time that I've been there, 18 trillion in debt, and we're approaching 30. We were savers and investors when we came out of World War II. We had the highest debt as a percentage of our GDP. We paid it off, built the interstate highway system. And use that as kind of an example of the way probably things ought to work. When it comes to climate specifically, who knows where we're going to end up in the long run in building my business over the years. To be successful, even if you didn't like what was changing on the horizon, you needed to be comfortable with the fact that you need to learn more about it. If you get good at kind of not overreacting, but then not sticking your head in the sand, that's a good way to navigate through anything. So the modeling on climate has been way off, but it's getting better. Whether you accept the science that when you unleash CO2, greenhouse gases, that have been underground, if that's going to heat up the atmosphere. I pretty well think the chemistry and physics make sense. The modeling, on the other hand, from 30 years ago would have had Florida underwater by now. And then, when you look at what the rest of the world is doing, your atmosphere, whatever you're doing here, spreads out. And you didn't have India, you didn't have Russia, you didn't have China, and you didn't have Brazil show up to the big climate conference that's going on right now. And here we are shutting down part of our energy field because we want to stay ahead of the curve when China's still building a coal-fired plant weekly. Doesn't make sense. So I formed the Climate Caucus in DC, just like I've been the biggest loudmouth on trying to reform the high cost of health care, which was a problem that all of us contend with. We actually found a way to control healthcare costs in my own business 13 years ago, and this will be for another discussion. We've not had a premium increase in 13 years. This stuff can't be done. But do you want the federal government to be the lead on it when their general prescription for anything is borrow more money, create more bureaucracy, and then where do you end up other than maybe with few results and deeper in debt? So when it comes to the Growing Climate Solutions Act, number one, it didn't cost anything. It's matching up good stewardship on the farm with, ironically, liberal offset markets, mostly on the West Coast. If they're wanting to pay for it and put money on the table, this is a way for farmers to be in the game. A little bit of overview on climate. In the U.S., farming is 10% of CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. You basically got transportation, electric generation, and industrial emitters, each about a third, 30% each. And when you talk about industrial emissions, it'd be concrete and steel. Of course, we need concrete and steel to build things. So whatever we do, we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath an economy that is finally energy independent. And when you got places like China that say they're still developing and they need a 10-year break, they need a 10-year, they want us to have, be out there 10 years before they got to kick in anything. So this was common sense. The farming community got behind it significantly. It's like anything in DC. The biggest holdup for it getting, when you pass something 92-8 in the U.S. Senate, I didn't think that was possible. And when you look at the cast of characters on the other side of the aisle, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, Cory Booker, and Jeff Merkley, the biggest liberal on the West Coast, they voted against it. And you know why? They don't want any mitigation. They don't want to offset anything. They want to completely shut down fossil fuels. Completely. If they had their druthers now, we'd have all windmills and solar panels, and you know, we wouldn't have electricity that's dependable. So that's why they voted against it. And then you got Jim Inhofe, who's the main fossil fuel senator, a guy like Josh Hawley from Missouri, who's kind of a cultural warrior. A lot of that stuff I agree with. And then Mike Lee, who's a friend from Utah that is more philosophical in his approach. Only 3 Republicans didn't vote for it. It's as good as you're going to get. It's a simple template that gets the ball rolling. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. If you're not in on the conversation, if you want to be the party of no or I'm not interested, well, that's what's on full display right now. Craziness. That if there were another 3 or 4 Democratic senators, or if it was like the LBJ days, when it was a supermajority in one party, 295, I think to 140, imagine that, in the House, 68 Democratic senators, we'd be buckling up along for the ride, and craziness would be across the board legislated, and it would be quick. So we're at a cusp, we're at a turning point, that if we don't engage, shame on us, you'll get that kind of stuff. That's where we're at. And this bill sadly, is being held up by the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee. That means a Republican in the House, because he's not interested in being in the conversation. So he's the guy that needs to have his ear talked into if we're going to get this across the finish line.
Well, I agree, Senator. It's not a matter, something's going to happen in this realm here with climate, carbon, and I want to make sure Farm Bureau, all of us farmers, are at the table in the discussion so we get reasonable provisions or solutions, and not something that's mandated. Probably when I talk to farmers, one of the biggest things that I hear is they want it to be voluntary. And I think, in business, you get a lot more, you get things accomplished a lot better if you use the carrot and not the stick. And I'm concerned at some point we're going to get to the stick, and we got to find the solutions. And farmers, you know this, you have a lot of program, and they're pretty darn innovative. They're flexible, they adjust, they do what needs to be done, and there's solutions. A little of my concern, and you might address this, is when you have so many players. I think the last count that I seen, there's about a dozen players in this carbon market. Contracts, we're analyzing currently the contracts, and vast difference between the contracts, what's responsible, what you got to do, what's the ramifications if you have a terrible year and you got to do something. But it's to make sure if farmers, which I believe farmers are the solution, a big part of the solution here, how do we make sure the revenue stream comes back to the farmer? And I'm concerned that the middleman takes the chunk of the money, and when it needs to be coming back to us. So any thoughts on how we do that? Are we assure that? And here's what made me think about this. About a year ago, I'm not going to rat out the company, but a large food company was in my office having a talk, and it was all about sustainability. They were wanting farmers to do certain practices, kind of which would fall in line with this. And they wanted us to help them, connect them up with farmers. And so about an hour conversation we got done at the end of that. And I said, well, I assume when you do this, you're going to extract more money from the market because you're going to put sustainable and all on your product. Well, absolutely. I said, so what part of that is going to flow back to the farmer? The guy looked at me like deer in the headlights and said, haven't thought about that yet. And I said, till you figure that out, we're not going to help you because you need the revenue stream back. And I don't know, with USDA being in charge of some things in your bill, is there any way we make sure that we can help get the dollars back, or to the ones really doing the work?
So number one, in this particular bill, there's an advisory group in there, and almost double the number of farmers that would be on it. And yes, big corporations, I don't come from there. I come from Main Street. My little business was 15 employees for 17 years. And I generally had to scrap against the bigger corporations. And I don't like big business when they're coming in with not only woke policies, but where they may, talk about something and not consider who's actually in the trenches that's got to put up with it. So I'm going to always be watchful of that, because in the time I was watching, and before I decided to become senator, that trend of concentration among big corporations is happening everywhere. It's in ag. Remember back 20, 30 years ago, you had a lot of options on inputs and so forth. They were local. You probably could shop around. Now we got 3 or 4 companies that kind of own a lot of, the stuff, even in agriculture. It's the same thing in healthcare. So you don't get into something and you're not being fully told about, well, what happens once you would, say, change your farming practices. I think that's where you need individuals there, like me, that might know what's going on, not having their staff inform them, willing to speak up. And look at this bill, it's kind of like the opening act. It's maybe not going to be perfect, but if we can somehow reward good stewardship, which now is maybe only paying 15 to 30 bucks an acre, when you look at what the marketplace is giving currently, climate was a back burner issue. It, in DC, has now moved up to the front burner. It's not on parity with a lot of things like the border, other things we hear about that have nothing to do with the economy. Healthcare is still the #1 issue out there. That even gets shoved aside when you're dealing with a pandemic like we have. But I view this as the opening act. And I think any of us that put the bill together want to make sure there aren't unintended consequences, #1. And if you do make the investment, which some of this is probably going to require changes in how you might be farming, and that you're going to want to make sure that you don't end up with just the cost of the investment and no reward on the other hand. Or if things change back and forth, that if you put somehow the formula is not going to be there balanced to where what happens in a certain year where you might have to do something just to get the crop in that might put you askance of what the guidelines were. That's where we have to give input. I don't think this is a fixed kind of bill. I think we'll be lucky if it makes it through the House and we get out there, and I think climate is something that, when I told you it's only 10% here in the U.S., it's 25% across the world. Agriculture emits more CO2 and greenhouse gases everywhere else other than here. So whatever we do here, that's going to be something the rest of the world is watching. And it's like a stock. You never know where something's going to go. I think the stock value of being concerned about climate is going to go up over time. And farmers are maybe the least able to take care of it just due to the fact you're in the trenches at the ground level of an industry that has gotten a whole lot riskier financially. The assets that you're playing with now versus 30 years ago, a lot higher. We got profit in the markets now. Well, that last time we had that was what, 09, maybe to 12, and then it went back to where things got pretty dicey for a while. If this can give us 30 to 50 bucks an acre, and you don't have unintended consequences in a normal year, most of us would take that as being a nice addition to maybe where you weren't making money or you were making a little more.
I agree. Some of the contracts we've looked at, and most of them have a non-disclosure. They don't want anybody to know. We have gotten hold of a few of them, and one of them we looked at, I know was paying about $12 an acre, but it was going to take about $20 worth of cost to get there. Those numbers don't work. So we got to figure out, and I think some of it was the middleman taking most of the money in between there. We got to figure out how to get the flow back. The transparency part of it, I see as a huge problem because, like you and I both agree, this is the Wild Wild West. I relate it to where hemp was a couple years ago, and there's a lot of unscrupulous players sometimes that. I know some people that raised hemp and still have their crop from 2 years ago and promised big money. And we just got to figure out, and I think your bill helps give some transparency. Or how do we do that? You got to have somewhat of a regulating body in having USDA, or you want to touch on how there's a lot of provisions in this bill, and to make sure we've got reliable partners we're working.
So the fact that it was done through the USDA, the FSA, we're all familiar with that. That, I think, gave a little bit of solace that at least whatever would happen there, you're going to have confidence that it might be a little more trustworthy than if you were just having to shop around in the Wild Wild West. So, and its basic function is to be the portal to where it's called certification. These markets that currently do pay, they want to make sure where your baseline CO2 footprint is. That was even a difficult conversation until just a year or two ago, because that would have been a costly affair. But you got technology now that, like a lot of markets, will weigh into it. So this, I think, I wouldn't put more into it other than it could be the first piece of climate legislation that goes through. based upon the least partisan part of politics in our U.S. government, which is agriculture. Ironically, the second least partisan would be defense. Most senators, red or blue, are sympathetic to ag, and they, thank goodness, believe that maybe the federal government ought to defend our country and maybe just do it better and costing less. But I think, I'm not so worried about fleshing out those details. I would have been mostly worried about, like most bills in Congress, take 8 to 10 years to get across the finish line. And this one happened in 2 years. And that, I think, is a function of, it was put together in a way that wasn't going to cost any money. It was there to give information and structure it. And then your entrepreneurs, like all the other sectors of the economy are, you've just got a more complicated business than most do, because no business has to interact with the weather. And the weather's tricky enough, and it's not going to be dished out in the same way across the country. My observation has been in the last 4 or 5 years, this is almost maybe the sweet spot of climate. We've got 3 to 4 inches more of average rainfall. It does come down in heavier doses, so your culverts and your infrastructure may be an issue, but that's another thing. Climate is not going to be uniformly disastrous. The modeling doesn't talk about that. We want to make sure whatever we do, we're providing something that makes sense, is easy to understand, and yes, that it doesn't cost you $30 and you only get $20 out of it.
Hans wanted me to remind you, there are cards on your tables. If you have questions, I think Hans will collect them, just get his attention. But if you have questions of the senator, please write them down and he'll pick them up and we'll try to get them answered. This passed the Senate, it's in the House. How would you handicap it? Are we going to get something to the president's desk? Or where are we at in this? Or what's it take? Is there anything we can do to help get it over the hump here?
All of the farm organizations that are across the country don't preach to the choir. You need to talk to your blue state senators and blue state congressmen. A lot of times blue and agriculture, don't go together as well as it might have 15, 20 years ago. But ironically, in the House, it's a Republican senator that's the ranking member of the Ag Committee. He will listen to maybe where most farmers, in the Midwest tend to be, and he is digging in simply because there are a few that don't want to be in the discussion or have anything called climate in a piece of legislation. I think that's short-sighted. I think that's how you end up in a cul-de-sac, or you end up in even growing a business where you're not listening to at least the pros and cons. If his reason would be for something practical, like it looks like this is nothing more to where you have to spend more for what you can get out of it, that's not it. It's philosophical. So weigh in on, I think it's G.T. Thompson, ranking member of the Ag Committee, and then it went through 92 to 8 in the Senate. Any of the states that have a disproportionate amount of Democratic congressmen and women, they need to have their ears bent.
Okay. I will say, I was in a meeting about a month and a half ago with G.T. Thompson, and this was the #1 conversation that we had. So we are working on it, but I didn't get the vibes he was moving very well when we had our conversation. But I know the ag groups.
So in handicapping it, I think that there are other ways you can shoehorn it into larger legislation. The amount of time that's been wasted in our U.S. government for this fanciful, spending spree bill that's been flopping around for about 2.5 months, that's eaten up a lot of time and space. It's not a fast-moving institution to begin with when it comes to getting stuff done. And when you get one piece of legislation that has come this far, then it would have to be reintroduced in the next Congress, and it has to start all over again. So I think it'll have every mechanical feature behind it to get it done, but then there's a lot of things that can waylay anything out there.
One of the factors that I hear as I travel the state, and I see Mr. Winning here, there's, Indiana's number 2 in cover crops, I believe. And there's a lot of farmers that are already doing these practices. And how can they reap some of the benefit? Or if you set the baseline where they are now, there might not be much, improvement because they're already doing the things. And, I'm a believer that they should be rewarded for being early adapters and doing these. And I'm not sure how this works out, but as we move forward, we got to be thinking about how do you keep the ones that are already doing it. They shouldn't be penalized for being early adopters.
So the way that works out is view this as a national market of ideas. And all I can tell you is in 2 years that I've been there, first of all, there was no Republican that wanted to talk about it. It only took me a month to get 6 others to join the climate caucus to be in the discussion. And what has changed mostly is, and I'll get to the particular of if you're already investing in cover crops, are you going to get rewarded? Across industries, and not only the ones involved in climate, transportation, electric generation, industrial emitters, it's been a quantum shift from disinterest to wanting to be part of the solution. And that means that the radical side of it is that they want to change things drastically and immediately and not worry about it. I mentioned that earlier. You're going to see markets start putting more value, the offset markets, into good stewardship or lowering your CO2 if you're in one of the other 3 categories. Will it reward for what you're already doing? To be honest, those markets are not. They're wanting to see whatever you're doing, that it's going to be a difference to it. So for anybody that is doing it for the sake of keeping their soil on their farm, or generally good stewardship, most of the markets are not giving you a reward. But if it keeps going in the direction I'm seeing, when the CEOs of all the larger companies across the country want a carbon tax. Hell, if you mentioned tax 2 years ago, everybody would have left the room. And now they're interested in being taxed because they know they're going to get hit with heavy regulation. The other side of the aisle wants to dictate that to you. And they're saying, well, maybe we ought to have a price on it rather than being beat over the head with regulation. I couldn't believe that. I've just been listening. I'm just telling you that's what I've observed. So that would mean down the road that if we keep going in the direction that this all becomes more believable, that they even reward existing good stewardship. Right now, to be honest, most of what's out there on these offset markets, you got a baseline where you are, and you're going to get credit for what you do above and beyond it. That doesn't mean it'll be like that. That's the way it is currently.
Okay, we got several questions here. One of them we kind of touched on, but talks about Representative Thompson and what's his issues with this. But I think you've touched on it. It's
mostly philosophical. He's slow to engage. If you're slow to engage in anything, you risk getting walloped by the other side with craziness, and that's kind of what's on display now on a broad array of issues. So
there's another one here that talks about carbon markets, and does this bill do anything to regulate it and understand, you want the market to find the price of where it needs to be, but how does this bill help in trying to regulate that? I think that's back to the Wild Wild West part of it.
It is in a way, and the other side of the aisle wants to do this through the Commodity Credit Corporation, number one. None of us are interested in that. That's getting too far ahead of our skis. This is just kind of that original discussion that gets formalized. And where you go from here depends on how aggressive are the offset market's going to be. If they're only 15 to 30 bucks and it's going to cost you 20 bucks an acre, hell, I wouldn't mess with that. It's going to have to get to where the markets are a little stronger. And all I can tell you is it's going to be one of two things. You're going to have either pricing at some point that most of the big corporations are now for. That all of a sudden formalizes everything in a different way. And if that occurs, I think it probably doubles or triples within a year or so in terms of what the value would be to sequester a ton of CO2. So much of this is, I believe you need to have that original discussion, formalized in a bill like this, and who knows where it goes. You just mentioned hemp. Well, hemp in 20 years may be a viable alternative. It is in 18 other countries, but right now you wonder what's happened in its shaky start out of the gate.
Yeah, it's definitely a shaky. I've had a lot of calls about that, and people thought they were going to make a lot of money, and I think they've lost a lot of money so far. Another question talks about the data and how do you support, or how do you get the data to know how much carbon's actually being sequestered, and is there any research, or does your bill address that, or how? Some of it's kind of laying the foundation for where we move forward, and how
It
does that
only
work?
addresses the process of who you would engage that would be certified baseliners, that would be credible entities to get to. If you're interested in learning more about it, you'll be able to go into your farm service agency and get the information, and that's what this bill is trying to do. Make sure the middleman don't take the biggest chunk out of whatever the value is, and to get the information to see if you're interested in messing with it. And my advice would be that you gotta be careful like you do in anything, but this is kind of the start of it, and we don't know where it's gonna go.
Okay, here's one. It addresses a little bit about when I asked the early adopters already, how do we encourage those that are already doing regenerative practices? How do we keep them engaged, or what do we do to help them that they don't get penalized?
So that idea about whoever's doing what currently, I mean, you'd have to look at what's motivating you to do it currently. There are farm programs in there, obviously, that involve riparian buffers, waterways, CRP, all of that stuff kind of plays into it. And those programs, I expect, are going to be the same. When it comes to this new discussion of whatever you might do above and beyond keeping your soil healthy and in place, that'll be a function of, is that going to be funded? I'm one that even when I like the stuff, like I think defense is the most important thing we do. I vote against the defense reauthorization bill because they won't subject themselves to audits, and they're not worried about saving any money. So I'd have difficulty even funding stuff like this, in the context that we're borrowing $1 trillion a year to run the government. And by the way, that's going up to $1.5 trillion once this stuff gets across the finish line. So it's never easy. And the federal government doesn't run like your local and state governments, your business, or like the state government that I was there for 3 years. So it's always tougher to see how that works out. And I could end up voting against something that could fund it if, in fact, we're still spending money like drunken sailors and borrowing most of it to do it. So.
Yeah, it's a little different in DC now than I've ever seen in my tenure of being around there, and I've never seen it as partisan. And we've just got a few minutes left here, and I touch on a couple other subjects. Going forward, we're going to go into a new farm bill here in 2023, which the House and Senate Ag committees will start working on that. I know there's been some hearings.
And zero discussion on most of it, just because it's been so kind of dominated by what we're currently watching every day on TV. So,
do you believe? You touched on this, and I am proud.
Randy, I don't think when it comes to farming and agriculture that there'll be anything there that would be drastically different from the way it has been. It is, when you do get down to the real sausage making, agriculture is going to have more interest in kind of both sides of the aisle working into it. I really think that's the case. So I don't think you're going to get walloped with stuff in the farm bill. There'll be a whole lot different from what the rhythm has been from before I got there, and the way it's been in a little under 3 years that I've been there. Just a question when we
that's yes, and that's hopeful, because when you see all the other politics, it makes you worry what happens. And I hope we can stay out of that crossfire of everybody else. And with some of this, I said earlier, we're way better off if you use the carrot, not the stick. And I hope as we write the next farm bill that they remember that incentives, you know, like all the conservation practices. My dad worked in what used to be SAR Conservation Service for 25 years, and there was a lot of incentives to put practices on the ground, and that worked great. And we just can't forget that. And it worries me when there's a segment there in DC that's probably never been on a farm and never met a farmer, trying to think they need to mandate how we do a lot of these things when they don't have a clue how it actually works in reality.
And a lot of times the mandate comes without funding either, so you're in that predicament. The stick versus the carrot, the biggest sign of the stick right now is a thing I'm leading on is the vaccine mandate. You know, regardless of what you think about vaccines, when you're telling businesses with 100 employees or more that you either force your employees to get a vaccine or not, that is the best example of, to me, a government gone wild, a stick that who knows what's going to happen there. That has officially just been rolled out. That, sadly, is one side of the aisle is going to have that propensity to do it. The other side of the aisle, many times, may be dismissive on the issue, or we don't want to be engaged. But that does bother me because whenever you're doing those kinds of things, and it costs money to boot, and in here where you're crossing that line that isn't even constitutional, there's so much of that out there right now that's going to make many people worried about what the landscape looks like and how it might impact agriculture.
Okay, we got a couple more questions. I know I'm looking at my watch. We're about to wrap
I'm
this
flexible
up.
on time. I just, after we're done, do have to get back north. So, but
I understand that. This one just talks about, having the incentives for carbon sequestration. Do you see a day then that farmers could be taxed for carbon emitted?
That would be the stick.
Yes,
Okay.
we just kind of touched on that.
And that would be in the extreme category of craziness. So, and I don't think that would happen even for the other side of the aisle, that when they want to do things, they don't care about how much it costs. They don't care about using the stick. That's the difference between being political entrepreneurs, which is kind of on display now, and that other extreme where you almost expose yourself to that kind of stuff because you don't get involved in the conversation. I would think that would not happen, and I think that was on display. Everything out there revolves around most people voting on how they think they're going to get reelected. That didn't make me a bit of difference when I ran. In fact, I said I wouldn't do it for more than one term. So what happened Tuesday in Virginia and New Jersey, going to have a lot of people wondering about the stick, how much money you're spending, how far ahead of your skis you are, and it might get more balanced. So, but it's that ebb and flow that happens over time, and hard to say.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that free enterprise and farmer ingenuity can solve a lot of problems, and we just got to make sure they understand that in our nation's capital. And I know you carry that message there every day, but a lot of them struggle at comprehending that. So there's one, it's not quite carbon, it's more the renewable energy, and it's touching on the wind and solar, and using up a lot of farmland for some of these things, and they just asking your thoughts on it.
So I know you got one down in this neck of the woods, right?
Yep.
And I guess that would be up to each landowner in terms of what he or she thinks might be the best use of their land. I hope that would always play into it. I would have a concern that you're putting solar panels on productive ground, and maybe you'd find places that couldn't produce a crop being an ideal place, but then it's going to be close to a transmission line. I visited a wind turbine farm, one of the 2 or 3 largest up in the Northwest. Well, that's less intrusive on ag ground, but they can't put up any more turbines because they're running out of transmission capability. So there's a lot of stuff that will kind of determine where, in fact, you can put solar panels. I would think that maybe you find a broad landscape of reclaimed ground that might be better down in our neck of the woods. That would be common sense to me and not taken out of the most productive. But then it's got to be close enough to a transmission line, or else if you don't get the ROI, if you got to build a long feeder into where the transmission is. It's got that complication. That all get worked out over time, and then it, I would hope, still is within the local jurisdiction in terms of any government, and ultimately the landowner who is going to have to make that decision one way or the other, rather than the top-down approach, whether it's coming from the federal government or the state.
Okay, Senator, it looks like we're getting the hook, but I want to say thank you for being here, taking your time, for bringing a little common sense to our nation's capital and what you've done. And just like this climate, like I said, climate bill, but it's a good start. It's trying to bring parties together. I know FACTA, which is Farm and Agriculture Climate Alliance, is a group of some partners that are very unlikely partners most of the time. Indiana Farm Bureau and American Farm Bureau is a part of that, and they've all supported your bill here, saying it's a movement in the right direction. It might be the first step of several, but we're getting there. So I just want to say thank you. Any closing comments before we wrap this up?
I love these conversations. I do them whenever I can. It's the easiest job I've ever had with time off. We get 16 weeks of recess, and this is one of them coming up. I travel the state. I vowed 2 things. I'd visit every night, all 92 counties every year. Already done that 3 years in a row. Any Hoosier can visit me in my office on a Friday. No senator's ever done that before. Pre-COVID, we were booked up 2 to 3 months. So ag is special to me. So you, any of your groups you're involved with individually, get a hold of Hammer. Come up and visit me on a Friday and we can discuss things further. Thanks for listening today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's show our appreciation.
We also want to thank President Kron for moderating the discussion today. You do have a couple of minutes before the first door prize drawing. It is going to be 5 pounds of BioCoke gold worth $229 from Advancing Ecological Agriculture. So if you want a chance at it, get your ticket up here right away. Looks like we've got our drawing happening in just a couple seconds.
Muddy.
There's just a few in here.
Your odds are good.
Yeah.
$229.
Looks like we're ready. Next drawing will be at 10 o'clock, so be sure if you haven't already put your tickets in, get them in there. So.
I just wanted to say that Citizens Climate Lobby is happy to be a co-sponsor of this event. We know that regenerative agriculture is good stewardship and it's good for the environment, so I really appreciate your efforts.
All right, thanks. I'm Nathan Hartman, Advancing Eco Ag. We're about to give away 5 pounds of BioCoke gold. That's enough to seed anywhere from 40 to 200 and some acres, depending on your seeding rate and weight. So I hope that there are actual farmers' names in here. If not, maybe consider donating it to a farmer. And this is a bacterial and fungal inoculant that is just dry spread on seeds right in the planter box, and is, in my opinion, the most cost-effective and easiest way to get started in all of regenerative agriculture. And happy to talk to you more about it. But thank you, Senator Braun and Indiana Farm Bureau and everybody for putting this together. It's really a pleasure to be here. Talk to you more. All right, the number is. Oh, there's a name on it. Great. Ron Trinio. Is there a Ron somewhere? number 618-609-6216. No, that's your phone number. Sorry. Ticket number is 384-5642. 384-5642. I think everybody would still be here at this point, but we'll set that one aside and maybe announce it again with the next one, so catch them. All right, thank you.